everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today or tonight, depending on where it is you're tuning in from around the world. My name is Bianca Collins. I'm the Curator of Public Programs for the Fowler Museum at UCLA. The Fowler is proud to co-present today's program with Wellcome Collection in London, redirecting perspectives on colonial archives and collections, as part of the Fowler's Curator's Choice series, during which we join curators for lively conversations about their passions and projects that inspire audiences to engage with different worldviews. What are the approaches to researching collections and archives gathered in the early 20th century? Henry S. Wellcome's enormous holdings included material from around the world, mostly obtained by his staff, researchers, collaborators, friends, and acquaintances. The material was first consolidated in Wellcome's possession and then dispersed to museums across the globe after his death. At both stages, much of the history of this material was obscured, if not lost. This program offers a glimpse at the work currently being conducted at the Fowler Museum and the Wellcome Collection to recover and highlight information about these objects, the artists who created them, circumstances of their acquisition, financial transactions surrounding them, and the roles of different individuals involved. Today, we are pleased to be joined by curators from the Fowler and the Wellcome Collection in London for brief presentations and a moderated discussion to address some of the complexities of tracing the provenance of objects from this collection and highlight the importance of collaboration in performing such work. A bit about our guests joining us today. Alexandra Evely is Collections Information Manager at Wellcome Collection in London, where she leads a multidisciplinary team of archivists, librarians, and museum professionals responsible for documenting and maximizing access to Wellcome's rich holdings. Her role also complements her research interests in digitally enabled participatory practices in cultural heritage contexts. In March 2020, Evely's team launched Transcribed Wellcome, opening up the Wellcome archive to the public in order to facilitate provenance research and a virtual reunification of the Wellcome diaspora, former Wellcome objects dispersed to museums and libraries across the world. Carly S. Forbes is the Mellon Curatorial Fellow at the Fowler, where she researches African objects donated by the Wellcome Trust to the museum in '65. Forbes received her PhD in art history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She has worked with the Akron Art Museum, the North Carolina Museum of Art, and the Samuel P. Harn Museum of Art. Her research focuses on art produced in the colonial period in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, museum and collecting histories and issues of provenance. Ruth Hori is collections curator in the exhibitions team at Wellcome Collection, where she works on temporary exhibitions and permanent galleries. Her background is in history, medical, and science museums and collections research. Previously, she was part of the collections staff at the Whipple History of Science Museum in Cambridge and a postdoctoral researcher mapping dispersed Iraqi archaeological collections in UK museums. Hori studied Henry Wellcome's historical medical museum for her PhD. Most recently, she has been researching Wellcome's junior museum staff and the networks of people involved in his collecting. Helen Mirz is Inclusive Collections Officer for Wellcome Collection in London. Her former roles include Keeper of World Art for Royal Pavilion and Museums, Breton and Hove, and African Diaspora Research Fellow for the V&A Museum in London. She is interested in the intersections between colonial era collections and contemporary diaspora communities. Erica P. Jones is Curator of African Arts at the Fowler Museum. She received her PhD in art history from UCLA. Since joining the Fowler in 2015, Jones has organized several exhibitions. In 2018, she curated a solo exhibition of Botswana-born painter Maleko Mokosi, Bread, Butter, and Power, and authored the accompanying publication. Her 2019 exhibition, On Display in the Walled City, Nigeria at the British Empire Exhibition 1924 to 1925, directly relates to the research conducted by the Fowler's Mellon team. Before we get going, one last piece of technical housekeeping. Once the screen sharing begins, I encourage you to click View Options and then select Side-by-Side Mode so the video feed doesn't cover any of the presentation. All right, that's all from me. Over to you, Carly.
Thanks, Bianca, and thanks everyone for being with us here today. So the initial inspiration for today's program was to promote a new digital resource at the Fowler that shares some of the Andrew W. Mellon funded interdisciplinary research that we've been doing for the past 2 years with the African objects in the Fowler's collection from the Wellcome Trust. Now linked on the Fowler's website with the web address you can see on your screen, you can view the first two of the series called Story Maps that we will launch over the coming months. The first story map that you see here on the left is an overview of our project, and the second on the right is a case study of a single object. We hope that you will take the time after this program to take a look. Next slide, please. As we were thinking of how to share the story maps in the program today, one theme that kept coming up was about the many aspects that go into researching with colonial archives and colonial era collections. Particularly, how do we research the material acquired for pharmaceutical magnate Henry Wellcome? Starting in the 1890s and continuing until his death in 1936, Sir Henry Wellcome amassed a private collection that included manuscripts, medical instruments, non-medical tools, architectural elements, weapons, paintings, ethnographic objects, and many other categories of global material culture. It's estimated that by the 1930s, the collections was 5 times larger than that of the Louvre in Paris. His historical medical museum provided a venue for exhibiting the works, and you see one iteration of the exhibits on the screen here. Following Wellcome's death in 1936, the trustees who managed the collection oversaw a long period of dispersal of the museum's collections to other places, through auction sales and some disposals, but mainly through transfers, gifts, and loans to other museums. Objects formerly in Wellcome's collections are now held in over 20 institutions across the world, including several thousand objects at the Fowler. So today's presentations are in collaborations with our colleagues from Wellcome Collection, which is the cultural ambassador for Wellcome, which is a charitable trust founded after Henry Wellcome's death in 1936, and today is an independent global foundation with a mission to solve urgent health challenges that face everyone. In our presentations, we will address our various efforts that seek to expand our knowledge of the collection, how it is recorded, the individuals involved in its creation, and its dispersal across the globe. While we all work with the collection, much of our combined research has only nominally focused on the collecting activities of Sir Henry Wellcome himself. Indeed, much of this work has already been done by other scholars. And since we know so much about Wellcome, more of our research has been to consider the other actors at play in the history of objects, from the makers to users, many buyers, and Wellcome staff. In decentering Wellcome as the primary actor behind the material's accumulation, our research provides further nuance for this collection and further extends our knowledge of the histories for several individual objects. An important step as we seek to use provenance as an avenue for reconnecting communities with works that now reside in museum collections. We recognize that with representatives from just 2 institutions, today's panel is rather limited in its scope and its composition, and we look forward to future paths for inclusion and collaboration with many scholars and communities, a topic we can elaborate on further in our discussion later in the program. So before we get started, a quick advisory message. Many of the presentations you are about to see and hear will reference archival material from the early 20th century and may include sensitive, outdated, or offensive language or imagery. And for now, let's get started by looking at some of the research we've been doing here at the Fowler. Next slide, please. To conduct this research, we have several avenues for uncovering the histories of these many actors. From archival cards that retain a short description, old acquisition numbers, auction information, and previous owners, to auction catalogs, many of which are now in the Wellcome archives and thankfully very much digitized now, thank you. And to material evidence, such as stickers, and material analysis techniques, such as portable X-ray fluorescence seen in use here. At the Fowler, we focused our efforts on the works from the Wellcome Trust that were made or used in Africa. And using our interdisciplinary methods, we have examined close to 2,000 objects from across the continent, providing updated information about the makers, users, sellers, and buyers of these works. While it would take us days to go through each case study, today I'll focus on just one set of findings, the material collected by MDW Jefferies. Next slide, please. With Jefferies, we have the opportunity to see just how difficult it can be to untangle the many priorities, influences, and complications that arrive when trying to study the works collected by just one individual. It seems that Jefferies first connected with Wellcome's collection curator, Louis Malcolm, who then recommended that Wellcome pay Jefferies for his collecting activities. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, Jefferies sent hundreds of objects to Wellcome. And there are several aspects Jefferies' career and activities that impact how we interpret the works that he collected. First, Jefferies was a white South African official who worked for the British colonial administration in Cameroon and Nigeria from 1915 until his retirement in 1945. Second, he was a scholar, having trained at University College London as an anthropologist and receiving his doctorate in 1934. He published prolifically on cultural practices in Nigeria. And third, he was a collector, having acquired for several major museums, including the British Museum. Next slide, please. As a collector, Jefferies clearly understood the market at the time and the desirability of works that showed use. As demonstrated in this letter from Jefferies to Malcolm in 1925, he writes, quote, "You naturally require only genuine stuff, i.e. not the usual curios that are cut and carved merely for trade purposes." So here we have Jefferies' anthropological interests in collecting of so-called genuine works and how they seem to go hand in hand. He goes on to present Wellcome with many objects over the next decade, including several that were accompanied by long ethnographies, including a series of objects used in practices to prepare women for marriage, and another set associated with burials of a well-regarded person. However, as we continue on in just the next line of the same letter, we see that he further explains. Next slide, please. It may not always be possible to secure the actual tokens, idols, etc. Would reproductions made to my order and compared by me with the originals do instead? This line complicates our understanding of the works Jefferies collected. What does he mean here by reproductions that are compared with the originals? In his correspondence with Wellcome staff, Jeffrey did not seem to distinguish between these commissioned works and what was original, and therefore complicating our view of what we consider to be quote, authentic versus quote, reproduction. Additionally, understanding where, when, and under what circumstances Jefferies collected is an important part of our provenance research. Commissioning a reproduction could have entirely different implications than purchasing a work that was in use by a community or individual. Next slide, please. In some cases, it's very clear what Jefferies commissioned. For example, this set of stamps was presumably made to document and study uli designs painted on women's bodies. Such stamps seem to have been innovations by the artist as a way to document the many patterns for Jefferies' anthropological studies, and were not used to actually paint women's bodies. As far as I know, no similar stamps exist in other collections. Next slide, please. However, other efforts to document uli patterns do exist in collections, such as the drawing here, which was also collected by Jefferies, and a second drawing collected by Winifred Yeatman, a missionary working in the area in the 1930s. With this plethora of documentation by non-Igbo people who desired to study the body painting patterns, it's possible that uli artists were adapting their knowledge and materials and finding new ways to profit from these new markets, and that Jefferies' commission of the stamps helped play a role in expanding the artist's repertoire or markets. Next slide, please. Other works are less easy to distinguish. For example, the Ikenga figures on the screen. Figures like these were used to celebrate success or triumph. Typically, the figures cover a range of styles, and the works we see here seem comparable to other objects in collections in terms of iconography or style. Our close examination of the surface treatments suggests that these were not necessarily newly made objects. However, it still remains impossible to know the circumstances of the objects collected and if they were commissioned or if they were the used objects that Jefferies purchased. Next slide, please. In spite of all these different collections, we're unclear about the exact circumstances under which Jefferies obtained the works or his relationship with artists or sellers of the objects. Jefferies' anthropological research cannot be untangled from his role as a colonial administrator, which cannot be untangled from his collecting work. We can only infer about Jefferies' relationship with the communities in which he worked. For example, he had a reputation of administering hard justice, earning him the nickname Hot Pepper. It was perhaps using his administrative contacts, his reputation of harsh justice and fear of retribution, or flat out coercion that Jefferies had access to so many objects. Or perhaps his commissions provided new avenues for artists to express his creativity. We just don't know. Although my presentation today has been short, I hope that it demonstrates some of the challenges and opportunities for analysis of works and collections. Although we are greatly aided by the presence of rich archives, archival research only leads us so far. Provenance research in and of itself is an ongoing process. In looking to the future, we need to push avenues for connections with communities in Nigeria to continue understanding the history and futures of these works. Next slide, please. So with that, it's that I pass the screen on to Alexandra and her presentation about Wellcome Collection's efforts to transcribe and digitize the archival material documenting the collection. Thank you.
Thank you, Carly. Good evening from North London. And before I begin, just thank you so much for colleagues at UCLA for the invitation to contribute to this programme and what I hope will be just the start of a reinvigorated partnership between our two institutions. Given our international audience today, I guess there'd be some people listening who've perhaps not heard of Wellcome previously or had a chance to visit London. So I thought I'd start with just a tiny bit of context about the organisation, Wellcome Collection, that I, Ruth and Helen work for today. Because although we no longer hold large numbers of 3D museum objects, Wellcome Collection is still both a public cultural venue and the de facto national library in the UK in the field of the history and culture of health and medicine. So our closest comparator in that regard is probably the historical division of the US National Library of Medicine. But the collections at Wellcome are more diverse in format and global in reach. We have extensive collections of prints, paintings and photographs, moving image and sound recordings, thousands of rare and early printed books, and a reference library of around 300,000 modern books. We also have significant holdings of manuscripts in more than 50 languages, and last but by no means least, archives and personal papers collections. And these, of course, include the archive which documents our own organisational history. And my role as collections information manager is to ensure these collections are well documented and available for use. We handle many thousands of inquiries each year about these collections. And in late 2019, we received an email from the arts and culture correspondent at the Guardian newspaper. The journalist was working on an article about the bronzes looted from the city of Benin in West Africa in 1897 and asked us if we could supply as much information as possible about the rather striking image that you see here on the right, which they'd located on Wellcome Collection's website. They asked us to share as much as we knew about the piece, how it came to be in Wellcome's collection, and to confirm its current whereabouts. Next slide, please. The photograph itself dates from 1952, when this item formed the centrepiece of an exhibition in London called The Medicine of Aboriginal Peoples in the British Commonwealth. Unfortunately, the photographer in the 1950s had recorded some crucial museum details. And so following this lead into our own institutional archives and a few transatlantic emails based on what turned out to be a rather lucky hunch, and about a week later, I had some answers for the Guardian. Next slide, please. The head was purchased for the former Wellcome Historical Medical Museum from Sotheby's in London in July 1934. But the intricately carved ivory tusk had been bought separately from another London auction house in 1931 and only later attached to the bronze head, very possibly, in fact, for the exhibition in 1952. And both objects are now at the Fowler Museum at UCLA. Next slide, please. But still in Wellcome Collection's air-conditioned underground strong rooms in London are close to 600 archive boxes containing the museum and the library's acquisition registers, hundreds of thousands of 6x4-inch index cards, staff reports, correspondence files, all of which taken together document the collection histories of individual items like the tusk and head. And this archive at Wellcome is also a vital resource for tracing many of these objects' subsequent onward dispersal to around 70 different museums across the UK and another 50 or so institutions still further afield in Europe, India, Africa, Australia and New Zealand, and of course to North America, including those which were gifted to UCLA. Next slide, please. And my team respond to at least one email each week asking for provenance details, how, where, when, and from whom Wellcome acquired a particular object, book, painting, or manuscript. There's also a strong and growing interest in exploring Wellcome's colonial era origins, And we want to be transparent about the circumstances in which Wellcome's collections were assembled and put on display, and about the sometimes contentious legacies still embedded in our collections today. We also want to be able to better support other museums like the Fowler Museum and researchers based in the countries in which Wellcome's collections originated to investigate more easily the provenance of objects which have been part of Wellcome's collections. Next slide, please. And it's precisely in order to facilitate this kind of research that the museum and library archive was digitized, and it's been openly available online since late 2017. Before that point, provenance research for a single object could take weeks. It could still be inconclusive, even for those of us who knew where to begin. Digitization then dramatically reduced access times, but the non-searchable handwritten and typed texts in archive records, like the ones on this slide, heavily annotated, dog-eared through use, meant that the archive remained opaque to all but the most intrepid of researchers. Next slide, please. And when it comes to mapping museum objects onward journeys from Wellcome, these challenges are often magnified by the extended timeframes over which dispersals to other museums occurred, and by the practice of using intermediary organisations to help with the distribution. So most of Fowler's collection, for example, went initially to the British Museum before being shipped to the US. And quite simple things like the most common means of labelling involved parcel tags tied on with string. Of course, they fell off or sometimes were removed during sorting. And objects were commonly sent to recipient museums with little or no accompanying documentation, often at best a 6x4-inch index card, which was sent separately to the objects themselves, sometimes some decades later. Next slide, please. The archive's also been successively rearranged as a result of the 20th century dispersals processes. And I included these flowcharts not because I expect you'll want to squint at the detail, but simply to give you an impression of the convoluted twists and turns that the researcher has to navigate in seeking to trace the provenance of any one item from the Wellcome collections. And the flowcharts here also show a pretty basic research journey through the most obvious parts of the archive, not the sort of detective work that Carly and Erica, for instance, have needed to engage in to trace some of the objects now amongst the Fowler collections. Next slide, please. In early 2020, I began to talk about the possibility of transcribing some of the archive records in conjunction with colleagues at the Egypt Centre in Swansea, who are the current custodians of around 4,500 objects from Wellcome. So when pandemic lockdown hit in March that year, we were in a good position to move quickly to set up Transcribe Wellcome. Archive transcription like this makes an ideal work from home project. You don't need any special collections expertise to take part, just some basic computer skills, a little interest in the archive being transcribed, and ideally enjoy the challenge of deciphering old handwriting. We supply participants with transcription guidelines, a simple spreadsheet template, and a batch of digitized index cards or accession register entries, which they then access through a web browser. And in completing their spreadsheet, the transcribers also help alert us to any apparent anomalies or unexplained abbreviations in the records, and also to any offensive or sensitive language. Next slide, please. After quality control checks, the completed spreadsheets are imported into a database so that the information that was previously locked inside typescript or handwritten records in the archive becomes fully searchable. Then, through collaboration with recipient museums like the Fowler Museum and working from current museum records online, we can also trace objects onwards dispersal, matching our transcribed archive records with contemporary catalogue information and imagery, gradually piecing together the Wellcome Collection's diaspora object by object. This matching process helps expose errors and other issues in the data, but Transcribe Wellcome has also positively identified objects for which provenance had been assumed to be irretrievably lost. It's virtually reunited objects with a shared acquisition source, and I hope also played a shared part in helping to promote an open knowledge exchange between museums and researchers, particularly perhaps as regards objects of uncertain or contentious provenances. Next slide, please. And Transcribe Wellcome's not only a tool for enabling research in respect to individual objects, it also opens up new opportunities for exploring the archive and analysing it at scale and in depth. looking at patterns of collecting over time or an analysis by geographical origin, or taking a deep dive into collections grouped according to the dealer or field agent involved in their acquisition. Ruth's going to give some more detailed examples in the next talk, but here I've chosen an excerpt listing the objects known to have been collected by the anthropologist Winifred Blackman in Egypt between 1927 and 1932, together with one of Blackman's notebooks into which she pasted photographs of the locations through which she was travelling. Next slide, please. We're absolutely delighted with the engagement we're seeing with the transcription programme and the new lines of collections inquiry that are opening up as a result, but we fully acknowledge there's a long way to go yet. Earlier this month, we passed the milestone of 50,000 accession entries transcribed, checked and available to search, but that still only represents around 7% of the museum entries known to exist and about 20% of the standard library accessions. But access is now available to museums and researchers on request, even though the database is officially still a working prototype. And we've been careful to license all of the transcribed data openly so that we will make the full data set publicly accessible in due course. And helping us to inch towards that goal on the 24th of February this year, we'll be running another of our successful Transcribathon events where we run live transcription throughout the day, aiming to complete a particular batch in one day. This time round, we're working on some museum cards relating to items dispersed in the 1970s. I'm afraid the timings for this aren't exactly optimized for the Pacific time zone, but if you might be interested in taking part but can't join us live, we will be recording the opening introductory session, and you can sign up at either of the links on this slide. Next slide, please. That's pretty much all I have time for now, but as I finish and hand over to my colleague Ruth, I do want to say a big thank you to everyone, particularly my colleagues in the Transcribe Welcome organising group, but also to all of our amazing transcribers and museum partners whose hard work and generous collaboration makes Transcribe Welcome possible. And finally, for anyone hearing about Transcribe Welcome for the first time today, if you're interested to access the database for your own research, you might want to lend a hand with some transcription or just have some questions about our work in this area in general, we'd love to hear from you at the email address given on the slide. But for now, I'll hand straight over to my colleague Ruth and ask for the next slide, please.
Hello, everyone. I'm Ruth Hori. I'm from Wellcome Collection, and I'm joining you from central London. Thank you to the Fowler Museum for the invitation. And what I'm going to share with you today is some recent research on staff and collectors working for Henry Wellcome's Historical Medical Museum. My examples here include objects from Nigeria and Cameroon, but I should say I'm not an expert in African collections, so I apologise for any mistakes in my descriptions. Next slide, please. So the history of Henry Wellcome's collections has often been told as the story of a single private collector who's said to have collected a vast stockpile of an estimated 1 million objects from cultures across the world. And this collection's mythology places the one man at the centre of all the activity. It neglects the complex networks of people and institutions that were involved in the collection's formation. And the reasons for this are various. They include a past historical bias towards elite figureheads and founders, and also Eurocentric histories of great men. Some other myths around the collection say that most material was undocumented and that there's little provenance information, or that it's too difficult to trace how collections were later dispersed to other institutions. And it is true that, as Alexandra has illustrated, that navigating these complex layers of dispersals and fragmented paper records is a significant challenge. But with digital tools and the dedicated staff time and input, our overview of this historic documentation is now more holistic than was available before. And it's opening up that single story and dispelling some of these myths. This is only a starting point, but an essential step in addressing the colonial context of the collection's formation. Next slide, please. So to begin with, the transcribed records are starting to give a more nuanced picture of collecting patterns over time. And this graph shows what's in the Transcribe Welcome database so far for objects that were catalogued as originating from Nigeria. So shown here according to the date in which they were acquired. Now, this is a first attempt at looking at the data this way. It will get more detailed as further records are transcribed. These are Nigerian objects only according to what's written on the records, and there are limitations of incomplete and incorrect attributions. But longer term, people should be able to research, for example, when artifacts were coming onto the open market from a particular region, and the relationships that this has to colonial and imperial activities, understanding the circulation of objects against the broader social and political landscape of the 20th century. And these kinds of visual overviews can guide the date searches into connected material. So I was interested in the pattern of Nigerian material acquired from 1927 here on the slide, shown in the red box on the right. And many of these objects are the ones collected by the anthropologist and colonial administrator Mervyn Jefferies, who Carly mentioned previously. Next slide, please. So Jefferies was funded, as Carly said, to collect in southern Nigeria and Cameroon for Wellcome's museum. And the material was arriving in large shipments from around 1927 through until 1938. Our archives actually have around 600 pages of documentation on this collecting, including correspondence and hand list of connected material, which I hope would be a future rich source for collaborations. Many of the objects that were acquired by Jefferies didn't actually stay in the Historical Medical Museum for long. Some were offered as gifts to other institutions, actually as early as 1942, which is only 4 years after Jefferies stopped collecting. This was due to shifts in the museum's governance and the direction of it after Henry Wellcome died in 1936. His trustees moved away from the wide anthropological remit of the museum towards a tighter focus on history of medicine, and this triggered the first waves of object dispersals. Think of Henry Wellcome maybe as the magnet who holds the collection together, and after he died, parts of it started to be split off across the 20th century, ending up at the over 120 museums. Next slide, please. So this map shows institutions who now have former Wellcome material. It's something I put together myself a few years ago, but it's based on work from the 1980s by Georgina Russell, who was a staff member involved in the last wave of object dispersals. So in terms of the Jefferies material, objects were gifted to the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford in 1942, the British Museum in London in the 1950s, and UCLA in 1965, what's now the Fowler Museum. Some were also placed on long-term loan to the Science Museum in London in 1978. So there's material across different institutions now. Next slide, please. Looking at what records have been transcribed so far for this material, there are records for objects originating from Aro, Ibibio, and Efik peoples in southern Nigeria and Cameroon. And they include ceremonial garments, items of clothing, carved figures, ritual objects, and some human remains. And some examples on the right from Fowler, Pitt Rivers, British Museum, and the Science Museum. We know from the archives, though, and a brief look at museums' collections catalogues, that what is in transcribed Wellcome so far is that small amount of the overall Jefferies object assemblages. There are potentially over 3,300 objects at the Pitt Rivers in Oxford and another 3,300 at the British Museum. Virtually reunifying objects around a collector like Jefferies can help us restore connections that were lost through the dispersal of the physical items. And that's because the records themselves are often organised around collectors. But going forward, it is essential to move beyond this privileging of collectors and provide ways into those records by cultural origin, geography, and theme to make them more discoverable and searchable. Next slide, please. In transcribing collections records, we also see who was practically doing the work in Wellcome's museum. And I'm not saying this has never been studied before. Researchers have looked at individuals and their practices, but we get a better overview in ways that weren't possible until now of people employed and the various workplaces like stores, display locations. And this list shows some of the many staff names that appear. I don't expect you to absorb the detail of this, but just see that these are many people. Written histories usually name the main curator in addition to Henry Wellcome, but they don't talk about junior staff. They don't talk about the casually employed specialists or the internationally based agents. We are gathering together brief biographies of staff and links to relevant parts of our archive on a documentation site. It's a work in progress, but it's public and the link is on the slide if you're interested. Next slide, please. Many of the junior curatorial staff across all the museum specialisms, and that's beyond anthropology, were white women, but there were a very few people of colour as well. These staff became invisible technicians in making knowledge, using a term from sociology of science, whose work was subsumed under the names of these main curators and figureheads. And I say this not to try and rehabilitate these white women involved in the anthropology collections, but in terms of understanding the people involved in institutional work and addressing this history. Some of the staff, particularly who catalogued and interpreted the African objects in the late 30s under curator Louis Malcolm, were graduates at the start of their careers, all educated into that turn of the 20th century colonial model of anthropology and ethnography. Rosa Burstein arrived at the museum in 1928 after studying folklore and anthropology in Wales and Oxford, and she oversaw the ethnography section and other museum working on the collections. Margaret Rowbottom is the only one I could find a photo of. She was a museum assistant from 1933 after getting a bachelor's degree in physics, and she stayed at Wellcome's museum for her whole career, in fact, organising exhibitions, recataloguing objects, and actually specialising in European history of science. Joan Lillico graduated in archaeology and anthropology at Cambridge in the UK in 1935 and joined Wellcome's museum in the same year, aged only 24. She catalogued and displayed the anthropology collections, including African objects, until she moved to Bristol Museum in 1948. Next slide, please. I got particularly interested to see if I could identify the staff who was writing in the accession registers and the index cards. So looking specifically at Joan Lillico, on the right of the slide is her job application letter from her staff file, and we've also got correspondence and handwritten reports of her work submitted each month. And we now know that Joan Lillico, by matching the handwriting, was the staff member who was actually cataloguing originally a lot of the Nigerian objects collected by Mervyn Jefferies. The card on the left is an Ibibio head ring made of hide that's now in Fowler Museum's collection. And I've been compiling other samples of staff handwriting to help us understand who was writing these cards. Next slide, please. So to finish, my examples today do look at the institutional history of Wellcome's museum. That is my research background, and having better resources for researching these staff can help us in understanding who was making the knowledge, for whom were they making that knowledge, and about whom were they making it. But it's not enough to replace the stories of Henry Wellcome with other stories about white European collectors and academics and staff. The museum records only ever will capture those values of the European past and the global north. They're not going to capture the values that the objects hold for their creators in African countries and communities. So institutionally, we need to acknowledge these silences and erasures and move towards centering the perspectives of the peoples and the societies who made the artifacts and the connections that these objects have in the present, thinking about how we can open up provenance information for a whole range of audiences and communities, which I hope we're going to pick up on further in the discussion. I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much. And I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Helen Mirz. Can I have the next slide, please?
Thank you. My name's Helen Mirz. I'm Inclusive Collections Officer at Wellcome Collection. I joined the organisation last April, and my role is focused on developing protocols for culturally sensitive material and progressing activity around repatriation. So given this, it's perhaps not surprising that I'd be interested in the longer history of returns made by the organisation. These are especially significant given that non-Western material made up about 50% of the vast collection amassed by Wellcome and his networks. In the period after his death, the problem of the large quantity of surplus material in storage had to be addressed. As we've heard, various strategies were employed, but in terms of the so-called ethnographic material, a special arrangement was formed with the British Museum through which, after making its own selection from the material, it would make a series of instalments of Wellcome objects available to third-party museums. Representatives of a number of institutions were invited to attend 10 such instalments, which took place over the period 1949 to 1954, to make selections. For those museums which had experienced bomb damage during the war, for example, Liverpool Museum, it was a valuable opportunity to augment collections that had suffered damage and loss. So what's of particular interest to me is that from the outset, material was given to museums based on the African continent. And in many cases, these distributions were conceptualized as returns. So today I'm going to briefly want to consider the context in which these returns were made, to introduce some of the key players involved, and to reflect on the relationship between these earlier transfers and contemporary approaches to repatriation. Could I have the next slide, please? In preparation for the dispersals in 1945, 1,300 cases of material were sent to the British Museum. This huge volume of material was divided into 10 batches, which in turn were unpacked and the contents laid out in the museum's Devine gallery. This image is it gives a sense of the scale of the material. And this image is of the 9th or 10th dispersal, which largely constituted weaponry. The dispersal process was overseen by Dr. Edgar Ashworth Underwood, Director of the Wellcome Museum, and managed by Herman Braunholz, the British Museum's keeper of ethnography. Braunholz oversaw the process of unpacking, and Underwood, operating on the instructions of the Wellcome Board of Trustees, coordinated the process of inviting museum representatives to make selections. There was a strict pecking order in terms of invited organisations, which were primarily national or university museums. From the outset, there was consideration of the interest of African institutions in the material being dispersed, and the government of Nigeria was invited to make a selection from the first distribution, which largely comprised African material before UK museums. This prioritisation was the outcome of discussions with the Colonial Office dating back to 1939 regarding the future of Nigerian material in the collections of the former Wellcome Historical Medical Museum. In time, other African institutions were considered, although the process of their coming to attention seems to have been more a product of serendipity than design. And across the 10 distributions, sorry, could I have the next slide, please? Across the 10 distributions, the Queen Victoria Memorial Museum in Zimbabwe, the National Museum of the Gold Coast in today's Ghana, and the Rhodes Livingstone Museum in today's Zambia were amongst the Africa-based organisations that would receive Wellcome material. So this slide is a draft list of recipient organisations across the 10 distributions, organised by date and columns going from left to right. African institutions are highlighted in yellow. So what was the significance of these institutions, and how were connections made between them and the individuals organising dispersals in London? As Paul Bassou has described, the mid-century was an important period for African museology, with the founding of new cultural institutions. Bassou notes that while the, and I quote, introduction of museums and legislation to protect monuments, antiquities and artworks came late to British West Africa, in the decade or so between 1948 and the time they became independent post-colonial nations, Ghana, Nigeria and Sierra Leone all saw the establishment of national or proto-national museums. It's important to note that these were, of course, colonial institutions, directed and largely staffed by white Europeans. However, Bassou warns us against reading these developments simply as evidence of the hegemonic forces of cultural imperialism, noting that in the absence of national policy for cultural heritage in Britain's African colonies, these initiatives were motivated by a divergent set of agendas. While undoubtedly informed by paternalistic notions of culture, education and development, the individuals behind these initiatives were also concerned about the loss of cultural heritage, a concern which might be familiar to us today. At present, we know very little about the material that was sent to these institutions beyond a few short descriptions, and this is an area for future research. However, we are learning more about the individuals involved in these exchanges, a process which is revealing the complex and entangled networks of relationships which evolved around the curation of and transfers of African material across British and African institutions in the mid-century. I could have the next slide, please. So briefly, just a few of the key players in these relationships. I've mentioned just a couple, but there are more listed here on the right. So as noted, the choice of recipient institutions for Wellcome material was directed by the Wellcome Board of Trustees. However, Braunholz, the British Museum's keeper of ethnography, sometimes sought to influence this selection, including by encouraging the transfer of material to African museums. In 1949, for example, he proposed that, and I quote, Nigeria be given an opportunity of securing some of the Nigerian specimens, such as Benin bronzes, for her own new museums. In this respect, he wasn't a disinterested party. having been commissioned by the Colonial Office to undertake a study on the preservation of antiquities and establishment museums in British West Africa. In his report, Bornholtz advocated for the protection of West African art, writing that, I quote, "In its totality, it constitutes a cultural heritage, the destruction or disappearance of which would be a grievous loss to the world as well as to West Africa." In the research trip he made to West Africa in 1946, he was supported by Kenneth Murray, who's pictured here on the left in a photograph Bornholtz took probably during the trip, an art historian who, dedicated to the preservation of Nigerian art, became Nigeria's first surveyor of antiquities and later director of its National Museum in Lagos. So unsurprisingly, Murray too would play a role in the distribution of welcome material to African institutions. So briefly, other individuals who lobbied for their institutions' inclusion in the dispersals included Elizabeth Goodall, honorary keeper at the Queen Victoria Memorial Museum, who advocated for several other Southern African museums to receive items from the Wellcome Collection. Arnold Walter Lawrence, who was appointed Professor of Archaeology at the University of the Gold Coast and Director of the National Museum, which was to be established there, for which he argued the Wellcome Collection could provide an invaluable nucleus. And Klaus Philippe Waxman, an ethnomusicologist who served as curator of the Ugandan Museum before returning to London, where he worked as scientific officer in charge of the ethnological collections at the Wellcome Museum. In 1963, Waxman took up a professorial position at UCLA, thereby providing a possible conduit for the transfer of Wellcome material to the Fowler. These individuals were key to the development of museums in Southern and Western Africa and were well aware of the threats to African cultural heritage, not least as an outcome of the colonial intervention of which they were part. As Basu writes, they were, quote, amongst the earliest proponents of the repatriation of cultural property in these contexts. However, in most cases, they were also elite white Europeans whose ideas manifested a paternalism that did not question the appropriateness of the cultural institutions for which they lobbied. In contrast, Wellcome Museum senior personnel exhibited a deep ambivalence about the transfer of cultural property to African institutions, which was tolerated only to the extent that it did not disadvantage British museums. Writing to Bornholtz about the selection being made by Goodall, Underwood comments, and I quote, "While I understand the heavy claims of a museum which is on the spot, I would not like to find that the representatives of the museums which were originally selected discover on their arrival that most of the best material had already gone." In her summary of the dispersal of non-medical Wellcome material, Russell concludes that overall the distributions were a success, enabling a large number of British museums to acquire material that they could not otherwise have afforded to in the post-war years, and a large amount of cultural property to be returned to countries of origin. However, the process of return was guided not by organisational policy, but by the interests and motivations of a network of individual actors, often in spite of the institution making the dispersals. To conclude, international museum policy today is increasingly supportive of the repatriation of cultural property, but the longer history of returns from Wellcome Collection should remind us of the extent to which repatriation relies on the agency and commitment of specific individuals on both sides, and to note the extent to which organisational responses to repatriation have historically been marked by ambivalence and self-interest. I want to conclude by arguing that any progressive contemporary approach to repatriation, such as we hope to develop at Wellcome Collection, must be informed by a critical reading of past returns in the context in which they were undertaken. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen, for your presentation, for broaching this complex topic of, the long history of returns from Wellcome Trust to African institutions. It can be really difficult to understand the role of individuals in these processes. And your examples here did a really wonderful job of showing how topics that feel so global are really so personal, so driven by the personal so frequently. And I think everyone really brought that up really, really beautifully. Everyone has rejoined us. This is wonderful. I'm looking at the time. We had definitely planned out a few questions. I don't know if we're gonna have time to get to more than one. So I know, Helen, you just spoke, so I'm actually gonna direct our first question at you and then open it to everyone else as well. I'm wondering how might the research that you've described support the creation of more equitable relationships with collection stakeholders in the future.
Thank you, Erica. I mean, I think I realised that a lot of the work that we do at Wellcome Collection that Alexandra, Ruth and I have described can feel very techie and institutionally focused and sometimes slightly self-serving. But I think for us, it's a really important step in building transparency, as Alexandra said, in ensuring transparency about how and where and the means by which objects were acquired. And that feels like a really important first step in undertaking the groundwork necessary to start to build equitable relationships with collection stakeholders, and also identifying who those stakeholders might be. I think moving forward, we're very keen to build our capacity and skills in terms of sharing collections knowledge and collections data, and building frameworks and partnerships for collaborative research, and also supporting research by representatives from stakeholder communities to undertake research on the collections as well.
I think we're trying very much to do a similar thing here at the Fowler. We're working on what transparency looks like and how to maybe carry that out in a digital space. So that's one of the goals of the story maps that we launched today, is to provide a space that allows us to really dig into specific objects and histories and in a kind of long form written narrative manner with lots of pictures, so that you can engage with the objects in maybe a little bit more exciting way than just looking at it in a single view. But we still have a long way to go, and I think we are learning a great deal from our Fowler partners who work on NAGPRA and all of their community relationships that they've developed over time, and thinking about how provenance research is a start for connecting objects with communities, but those communities can also share a great wealth of information about objects, and thinking about how we can imagine these new community connections to even expand our knowledge of the objects and what that looks like in the future.
Yeah, I would want to pick up on that and thinking about that relationship between the institutional and the necessity of doing that foundational step to actually understand who are these institutional actors involved, particularly because in our archives, historically, those people have been privileged in how the information is organized. So like around Jefferies, for example, that the hand list and the material that actually gets to the specific peoples and geographies involved in the collecting may be all subsumed under Jefferies' name, but not easy to find if you're searching for Nigeria or specific peoples. And there is a step to start opening that up, but it's not in itself an endpoint, and engaging with this complex sort of colonial and ableist history of Henry Wellcome's collections has to come from multiple perspectives, which is something that Wellcome Collection is doing across its public-facing program. And for example, from thinking through the partners, the artists we work with, the creative practitioners, the front of house types of outputs, as well as the cataloging and engaging with diverse research communities, that's a necessity to actually move us beyond these foundational steps.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have time for one more question, or do we need to, one more question? Okay, great. So, I mean, you guys have outlined all of this work. I know working with Carly, there is so much work that we have done yet, and there is so much work yet to be done. So, what are the next steps in your research, in your projects, and what possibilities does having more provenance information open up? How do we expand the reach of our research, basically? Those are some of the big questions. So anyone feel free to jump in.
I'll maybe kick us off here with yet another preview. So everyone can go look at the Fowler's webpage for the story maps, but also in July, in our Fowler in Focus gallery, we will be having an exhibition that will look at provenance, specifically of 6 case studies. So if you're in Los Angeles from July until I think the end of October, come stop by, see us, and we'll look at some objects together.
Perhaps I can pick up on that on a slightly more practical collections-based viewpoint, and also picking up on the subtitle of my talk, which was piecing together the Wellcome diaspora and thinking of a jigsaw as a kind of metaphor to underline the importance of collaboration, interinstitutional collaboration in next steps, because we have a lot of documentation at Wellcome, but it doesn't cover the whole picture, and it's only by sharing data and sharing research. The fact that both Ruth and Carly talked about Jefferies was actually a complete coincidence, and they're both coming at the same question but from different angles. So that collaboration is really important. I think further digitization is really important. I don't just mean sticking images online, although that's very useful, obviously, for access across, US, UK, Africa, Australia, but also digitizing in the sense of digitizing the text so that we can start to read the archive against the grain in a way that you cannot across an institutional archive the size of Wellcome's on paper, because it's just too large, too much volume. And then a point about diversifying the communities and the people that we work with, and then ensuring that their perspectives change our collections management perspectives, which is something that's very new to us in the UK. I think it's possibly more familiar to colleagues in the US through experience of NAGPRA and working with Indigenous communities in the US. For us in the UK, this is a very new departure. We've just been successful in getting some joint funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities in the US and the AHRC in the UK to work with a tribal library in the Navajo Nation, and we're extremely excited about what that might provide for us, but also very careful to ensure that we can we don't just extract knowledge from the people that we work with, but we use it as an opportunity to build the future together. And on which note, I don't know, Ruth, if you've got a couple of other Wellcome things you want to add to that.
Yeah, I guess what I would want to add is that, as you've said, there are a multiple of approaches that Wellcome Collection is taking in terms of who we work with, and, as part of our commitment to access, diversity and inclusion in our strategy, representing those multiple perspectives comes across our programming. So the artistic program of temporary exhibitions, of publishing, of digital, and of collections. And so part of that is we'll be replacing the collections gallery that currently favours Henry Wellcome and his collecting approach to something in future which centres the voices and the peoples who have been silenced and marginalised. And also recognising that our collections do have these injustices within them, and actively moving to collect and centre perspectives of people whose life experiences or health experiences haven't been represented in our collections previously. So it's part of a broader approach that situates some of these specific examples into a bigger institutional programme going forward.
Thank you for all those responses. Yeah, a lot of work to be done, but it's all pretty exciting. Bianca.
Yes, thank you so much to the Wellcome team in London for joining us today for this important conversation. We really appreciate you sharing with us some of the work you're doing to uncover and make available myriad histories associated with the Wellcome Collection. So thank you very much for sharing that with us today. And of course, thanks to Carly and Erica for choosing this as your curator's choice and collaborating with us to make this happen. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. This program has been recorded. It will be available immediately on our Facebook, and in a few days will be uploaded to our Instagram and onto the Fowler website for you to revisit and share. And we hope that you will join us again for our next program. You can find information on the closing slide. In the meantime, have a great day or evening wherever you are. See you next time. See ya.